I was 20 years old, standing in the Ravalli County Recorder's office on a Tuesday morning in February 2019, holding a money order for $47.30, buying 31 acres of cursed rock that nobody in Montana had wanted for 130 years. The old man behind the counter looked at me over his bifocals, asked me 3 times if I understood what I was signing. No road access, no water rights, no timber. Just limestone and snow and the ghosts of 4 men who died in a mine collapse back in 1893. I told him I understood. What he didn't know, what nobody in that town knew, was that my grandfather had stood in that exact same office at that exact same counter 48 years before, paid $43 in back taxes for the same worthless ridge, and then spent the next 4 decades making sure nobody ever found out why. My name is Hollis Brennan. My grandfather Silas died of lung cancer 3 months before I walked into that office. He left me a farmhouse, 8 acres, and $73,000 in debt. The bank was already circling like wolves. But he also left me something else. Something hidden in a barn under a tractor that hadn't run since 1981. And it changed everything. I was 20 years old, standing in the Ravalli County Recorder's office on a Tuesday morning in February 2019, holding a money order for $47.30, buying 31 acres of cursed rock that nobody in Montana had wanted for 130 years. The old man behind the counter looked at me over his bifocals, asked me 3 times if I understood what I was signing. No road access, no water rights, no timber, just limestone and snow and the ghosts of 4 men who died in a mine collapse back in 1893. I told him I understood. What he didn't know, what nobody in that town knew, was that my grandfather had stood in that exact same office at that exact same counter 48 years before, paid $43 in back taxes for the same worthless ridge, and then spent the next 4 decades making sure nobody ever found out why. My name is Hollis Brennan. My grandfather Silas died of lung cancer 3 months before I walked into that office. He left me a farmhouse, 8 acres, and $73,000 in debt. The bank was already circling like wolves, but he also left me something else. Something hidden in a barn under a tractor that hadn't run since 1981. And it changed everything. The clerk's name was Harlan Pike. I didn't know it then, but his name would matter later. He was 71 years old, thin as a fence post, wearing a corduroy jacket that had been brown once and was now the color of weak coffee. His hands shook a little when he picked up the money order. Not from age, I'd learn later. From something else. Stillwater Ridge, he said slow, like he was reading the name off a tombstone. Parcel 44-12-09, 31.2 acres. Yes, sir. You read the disclosure. I did. You know about the mine. I nodded. Everybody in Bitterroot Valley knew about the Olmsted mine, even kids my age. 4 men buried alive in May of 1893. Cave-in took the whole east shaft. They never recovered the bodies. The owner, a man named Cornelius Olmsted sold off what was left of the operation for pennies and moved to Spokane and drank himself to death by 1897. The mine had been sealed by the county in 1911, and the surrounding land was declared unsuitable for development. 130 years later, here I was, buying it for less than a tank of gas. Harlan Pike set the money order down on the counter. He stared at it for a long second. Then he looked up at me, and there was something in his face I couldn't read. Not pity, not amusement, something older than both. "You know," he said, "your grandfather stood right where you're standing." I didn't say anything. I'd grown up around old men in feed stores and gas stations who knew Silas Brennan, who'd worked alongside him, who'd loaned him a wrench in 1976, and remembered it 40 years later. Montana's like that. Nothing dies. Everybody remembers everything. "March of 1971, Harlan said. "He came in here and paid the back taxes on this same parcel. $43. I was 23 years old, just started working in this office. I thought he was crazy." He picked up the deed transfer, slid it across the counter toward me, and pressed the county stamp down on it. The sound was small and final, like a door clicking shut. "Guess crazy runs in the family." I picked up the deed. My hand was steady. I folded it, once slid it into the inside pocket of my coat, and walked out into the cold without saying another word. The wind was coming down off the Sapphire Mountains that morning, the kind of wind that gets inside your collar and sits there. I stood on the courthouse steps for a minute, just looking at the town. Ash Fork, Montana. Population 1,183. 1 stoplight, 2 churches, a feed store, a bank, a diner, a hardware store, a cemetery on the hill where my grandfather had been laid to rest the 3rd week of November. I walked back to my truck. It was a 1996 Ford F1 53/4 ton, the paint sun-bleached from red to something closer to pink. My grandfather had bought it new when I was a baby. It still ran. Everything my grandfather had ever owned still ran because he never threw anything away, and he never bought anything he couldn't fix himself. The drive home took 22 minutes. East out of town on County Road 281 past the Tunstall Dairy operation, where Dale Tunstall had 800 head of Holsteins and a wife who'd left him in 2003 and a son who wouldn't speak to him. Past the old Methodist church that had burned in 1989 and never been rebuilt. Just left standing there, 4 blackened walls and a chimney like a warning. Then up the long gravel road that climbed past the Whitlock place and the Coyne Orchard, and finally turned in at the cedar gate my grandfather had hung in 1981. The gate still swung clean. He'd set the posts in concrete and hung them with proper hinges and never had to touch them again in 37 years. The house was a 1947 Craftsman painted gray with a wraparound porch and a tin roof that needed work. Behind it sat the barn bigger than the house, with double sliding doors and a hayloft and a stone foundation my grandfather had laid by hand in 1968. 8 acres of pasture, mostly fenced, some of it gone to scrub since he'd gotten sick. I parked the truck by the porch, sat there with the engine off, listening to it tick as it cooled. The deed was in my coat pocket. I could feel it against my ribs, the way you can feel a letter you haven't opened yet. $73,000. That was the number. Cascade Mountain Bank held the mortgage. My grandfather had refinanced in 2009. Against my grandmother's wishes, she died in 2011, before I was old enough to understand any of it, and the balance had crept up year after year, as his medical bills did. 4 payments behind. Foreclosure proceedings would start in June if I couldn't bring it current. I was making $9.80 an hour at Henderson Feed and Supply, working 5 days a week and picking up Saturdays when they'd let me. After taxes, that came out to around $310 a week. The mortgage payment alone was $1,142 a month. The math didn't work. The math hadn't worked for a long time. I went inside. The house was cold. I'd let the wood stove die that morning before I left for the courthouse, and the cold had crept back in through the single-pane windows and the gaps under the doors. I stoked the stove, fed it 3 pieces of split larch from the rack by the kitchen, and waited for it to catch. Then I went out to the barn. The barn was where I'd been spending most of my evenings since November, sorting through what my grandfather had left behind. Tools, mostly. Decades of them. Hand planes and chisels and crosscut saws, and a wall of mason jars filled with washers and bolts and brass fittings, every one of them sorted by size, every jar labeled in his small, slanted handwriting. There was a workbench he'd built in 1964, out of fir timbers salvaged from a torn-down granary, and above it a pegboard that held every wrench he'd ever owned, hung in order from smallest to largest. I'd been looking for something. I didn't know what. Some clue, some answer, some reason why a man who'd worked his whole life and never taken a vacation and never bought a new vehicle in 40 years had died $73,000 in the hole. In the back of the barn, past the workbench, past the stalls where he'd kept 2 horses until 2005, there was a tarp. Big, green canvas tarp, heavy as a wet coat, draped over something man-sized in the corner. I'd looked at it 6 times since November and never bothered to pull it back. I'd assumed it was just more equipment. That afternoon, with the deed for Stillwater Ridge in my pocket and the cold settling into my hands, I went over and pulled the tarp off. Underneath was a tractor, a 1953 Alice Chalmers Model C, a orange paint, mostly gone tires, flat. The seat cracked and the steering wheel rusted to the column. There was mud caked in the wheel wells, dried hard as concrete. 40 years of dust on everything else. I knew this tractor. My grandfather had told me once when I was maybe 8 that he'd parked it in 1981 and never run it again. I asked him why. He just said it had served its purpose. That was the kind of answer he gave when he didn't want to talk about something. I walked around it, ran my hand along the hood. The mud in the wheel wells was the color of the soil up at Stillwater Ridge, not dark loam like the bottomland along the creek. Pale chalky, full of crushed limestone, the kind of dirt you only find on the ridges. I knelt down and looked under the tractor. There was a wooden crate sitting on the dirt floor pushed up against the rear axle. Pine dovetailed corners, the kind of crate that used to ship apples in the 1950s. I had to lay on my back and scoot under to drag it out. It was heavier than I expected. I pulled it into the light by the workbench and brushed the dust off the lid. There was no label, just a small brass hinge and a hasp without a lock. I opened it. Inside was a leather notebook, cracked and soft at the edges, the cover blackened with age. Beneath it, a stack of folded survey maps, brittle as autumn leaves. Beneath those, a small canvas pouch drawstring, closed heavy when I lifted it. And at the bottom of the crate, a single object wrapped in oilcloth. I unwrapped the oilcloth first. Inside was a brass surveyor's compass, the kind with a folding lid and a needle that still spun true. My grandfather's initials were engraved on the back. S.R.B. Silas Reese Brennan. I set the compass aside and picked up the notebook. The first page was dated March 17th, 1971. The handwriting was unmistakably his tight, slanted every letter, careful the way men of his generation had been taught to write when handwriting still mattered. Bought the Stillwater Ridge parcel today. 31 acres. Paid $43 in back taxes. Let the bank laugh. I read it twice. Then I turned the page. 12 years underground in Butte taught me how silver moves. The Olmsted vein didn't dry up. They just stopped looking in the right place. The east shaft caved because they ran it wrong. Followed the bedding plane instead of the fault. I walked the ridge today. The fault's there, same as the maps I traced in the assayer's office last winter. They missed it by 30 feet. I sat down on the floor of the barn with my back against the workbench, and I read. I read for 2 hours straight while the light through the high windows turned gray and then yellow and then almost dark. I read about my grandfather's 12 years in the Anaconda copper mines outside Butte, Montana, from 1953 to 1965. About the old miners who'd taught him to read Rock Welsh and Cornish men who'd come over with their fathers who knew silver and copper and tin the way farmers know weather. I read about the night in 1962 when a friend of his named Tomas Krebs had been crushed in a roof collapse, and how my grandfather had spent 2 days digging through the rubble with his bare hands before they pulled out the body. I read about his decision to leave underground work in 1965 and come home to Bitterroot Valley to farm. About marrying my grandmother Edith. About my father being born in 1967. And I read about the ridge. For 10 years before he bought it, he'd been studying it, reading old assayers' reports in the archives, walking the property line in the dark when the snow was deep enough to cover his tracks, mapping the geology from the road with field glasses. He'd known about the Olmsted mine since 1959, known that the original owners had given up too early that the silver vein hadn't been exhausted, that everyone who'd written the property off was wrong. But he hadn't moved on it, not for a long time. The journal entry from November 1970 said, "Edith wants no part of mining. Says she didn't marry me to be a widow. She's right. I'll buy the land. I won't dig it. Not while she's alive." I read that line 3 times. Then I closed the notebook and sat there in the dark. My grandmother had died in 2011. My grandfather had died in 2018. There were 7 years in between. 7 years when he could have done anything he wanted with that land. He could have hired a crew. He could have brought in equipment. He could have made himself a rich man twice over. And as far as I knew, he had never set foot on Stillwater Ridge again. I went back to the house. I made coffee. I built up the fire and pulled a chair close to the stove and laid the journal on my lap. The next entries were faster, less careful. He'd started visiting the ridge alone on weekends, walking the surface, taking samples, building a picture of what was underneath. By 1973, he'd identified what he believed was the original fault line, the one the Olmsted crew had missed. By 1975, he'd traced it nearly half a mile across the property, marking it with small cairns of limestone that no one but him would ever recognize. But he hadn't dug. In 1978, he wrote, "I've taken enough samples to know what's there. Better not to disturb it. Better to let the ground keep it secret. The county thinks the parcel is worthless, long as they think that the parcel is safe." I read that, and something cold went down my spine. He hadn't bought the land to mine it. He'd bought it to protect it, to keep it out of anyone else's hands, to make sure nobody else would ever find what he'd found. I closed the journal and stared at the fire for a long time. Outside, the wind was up. I could hear it under the eaves working at the loose shingles on the south side of the roof. The fire popped. The kettle on the stove ticked as it cooled. I went to bed at midnight and didn't sleep. In the morning, I drove into town. The courthouse in Hamilton was 28 miles south on Highway 93. I'd been there twice in my life, once for my driver's license at 16, once with my grandfather when he renewed his concealed carry permit when I was 11. I parked on Main Street and walked up the steps and asked the records clerk for the original 1889 plat maps of the Stillwater Ridge parcel. The clerk was a woman in her 50s named Mara Whitlock. I knew her. She'd gone to high school with my mother before my mother left town in 1999. Her daughter, also named Mara, was 20 years old and worked in the same building in the assessor's office. The mother went to look for the records. She was gone 20 minutes. When she came back, she had a rolled tube of linen paper, brittle and yellow, smelling like a wet basement. She unrolled it on the long oak table in the records room and held the corners down with brass weights. "This is the original," she said. 1889. Cornelius Olmsted filed it the year he opened the mine. I leaned over the map. It was hand-drawn in India ink, the lines still crisp where they'd been protected from light. The Stillwater Ridge parcel was shaded with a fine crosshatch. The Olmsted mine was marked with a circle and an X, with the 4 shafts radiating out from the central works. East shaft, west shaft, north shaft, south shaft. And in the lower left corner, in a different hand in pencil, almost too faint to read, was a notation that hadn't been there in any of the modern surveys. Secondary vein, northeast quadrant, not developed. HC 1891. HC Henry Caldwell, the original surveyor. I traced my finger along the northeast quadrant of the parcel. It was the highest part of the ridge, the rockiest, the most useless for anything anyone would want to do with land. No timber, no grazing, just exposed limestone and shattered shale. Exactly where my grandfather had marked his cairns. I asked Mara Whitlock if I could pay for a copy. She looked at the map. Then she looked at me. There was something in her face, the same look Harlan Pike had given me the day before. Old people in this valley knew things younger people didn't. They remembered who had stood on what land and why and what had come of it. $7, she said. I'll have it for you in 20 minutes. I waited on a bench in the hallway. The Hamilton Courthouse was built in 1900. The benches were the original oak, worn smooth in the middle from 120 years of people sitting on them, waiting for one kind of news or another. I sat with my elbows on my knees and looked at the floor. When Mara came back with the copy, she didn't hand it to me right away. She stood there a second holding it. Your grandfather came in here in 1970. She said, asked for this same map. I was 19 years old, brand new at the job. I remember because he was the only person who'd ever asked for it. The original map, not the modern one, the original. She handed it over. Be careful, honey. I drove home through a sleet storm. The wipers couldn't keep up. I had to pull over twice and waited out sitting in the cab of the truck while the heater fought the cold, and the sky came down in horizontal lines of ice and water. I made it back to the farm by 3 in the afternoon. The light was already going. February days are short up here. I stoked the fire, ate a cold ham sandwich standing at the kitchen counter, and went back to the barn. I spread the copy of the 1889 plat on the workbench. Then I opened my grandfather's journal to the page where he'd sketched his own map, the one he'd drawn in 1973, the one with the cairns. I laid them side by side. They matched. His cairns marked the exact line of Caldwell's undeveloped secondary vein. I stood there a long time looking down at those 2 maps. The light coming through the small window above the workbench had gone the color of old steel. The wind had picked up again outside. I could feel it pushing at the south wall of the barn. My grandfather had known about a silver vein on a piece of land everybody else thought was worthless. He'd kept the secret for 47 years. He'd died with it, and he'd left me a journal that told me everything. The next morning was Friday. I was scheduled to work at the feed store from 7 to 4. I called in, told the manager, a man named Reb Kinsler, that I had something I had to take care of at home. He didn't ask what. He'd known my grandfather. He knew the place was a wreck. He just said, okay, and to come in Saturday if I could. I drove up to Stillwater Ridge that morning with the journal in my coat pocket, the surveyor's compass in my other pocket, and the canvas pouch from the bottom of the crate sitting on the passenger seat. I hadn't opened the pouch yet. I'd left it sealed. The road up to the ridge wasn't really a road. It was an old logging track, half overgrown, accessible only from a turnout off County Road 281 that you'd miss if you didn't know to look for it. I parked the truck at the turnout. The track climbed steeply through second-growth fir and lodgepole pine thick with snow, the kind of country where you could walk 50 feet from your truck and never find it again if the weather turned. I hiked in. The ridge was about 3/4 of a mile from the road. I had my grandfather's surveyor's compass and his journal, and I used them to navigate. He'd written down the bearings from the turnout. North-northeast, 312 paces. Due east, at the split spruce, 180 paces. He'd done this walk so many times he could probably have done it blindfolded. The cairns were exactly where his map said they'd be. Small piles of limestone, weathered, half buried in snow and moss, easy to miss if you weren't looking. I counted them as I went. 1, 2, 3. The fault line ran across the ridge at a 40-degree angle exactly as he'd drawn it. At the 7th cairn, the journal said to stop. I stopped. I was standing in a small clearing on the high side of the ridge. The wind up here was constant, coming down off the sapphires, carrying the smell of snow and pine. To my east, the ridge dropped away in a steep limestone face. To my west, more forest. The ground at my feet was rocky, exposed, scoured of soil by a century of weather. The journal said 12 feet north. Pile of brush. Don't be slow about it. I walked 12 feet north. There was a pile of brush. Cut limbs of fir and pine stacked tight, weathered gray. The kind of pile that if you walked past it, you'd think had fallen from a windstorm. Natural. Random. It wasn't natural. It wasn't random. I started pulling the branches off. It took me 20 minutes. The brush was older than I was. Some of the limbs had been cut decades ago. The bark long gone. The wood underneath silver and hard. Underneath the brush was a layer of old canvas tarp, weighted down with stones. I pulled the stones off, peeled the tarp back. Underneath the tarp was a wooden door, a door, set into the ground at an angle. Plank construction oak, banded with iron straps. A heavy padlock through a hasp. The door had been there a long time. The wood was dark with age, but the iron bands were free of serious rust. Somebody had oiled them once a year, maybe more. Somebody had kept this door in working order for half a century. I stood there in the snow looking at it. The Olmsted mine had 4 shafts, east-west, north-south. They'd all been sealed by the county in 1911. They were on official record. They were marked on every modern map of the area. This door wasn't one of them. This was a 5th way in, a way nobody else knew about, a way my grandfather had either found or made. I pulled the canvas pouch out of my coat pocket, the one from the bottom of the crate. I'd brought it because the journal had told me to. There was an entry near the end of the book dated September 4th, 1981 that said, "The pouch contains what opens it. Bring it if you come." I loosened the drawstring. Inside the pouch was a brass key. Heavy hand forged, the head wrapped in waxed twine to keep it from rattling. Just one key. I knelt down at the door and slid the key into the padlock. It turned. The lock came open in my hand with a small dry click, the sound a key makes when it remembers a lock it hasn't touched in 37 years. I lifted the hasp. I set the padlock aside in the snow. I took hold of the iron handle on the door and I pulled. The door came up heavier than it looked. The hinges were stiff, but they moved. I propped it open against the brush pile. A cold draft came up out of the dark, the smell of stone and old timber and something else, something mineral, something that wasn't quite metal and wasn't quite earth. Below me, a flight of stone steps led down into the ridge. The first 3 were visible in the daylight. After that, the dark. I stood there at the top of those steps for a long time. The wind was at my back. The snow was starting again, fine and dry. The flakes drifting past my face into the open dark. My grandfather had hidden this for 47 years. He'd kept it from his wife. He'd kept it from his son, my father dead at 26 in a logging accident in 1993, 6 months before I was born. Who'd never known the land he stood on hid a fortune. He'd kept it from the county, from the bank, from his neighbors, from his own grandchild for the 18 years I'd lived with him. And he'd left me a key. I reached into my coat pocket and took out my phone. The signal up here was nothing, 1 bar, sometimes none, but I didn't need a signal. I just needed the flashlight. I turned the light on. I aimed it down the steps. The beam caught the stone walls, hand-cut every block, fitted with the kind of care a man takes when he's working alone and has all the time in the world. 20 steps, maybe 25. At the bottom, the beam reached a wooden door. A second door, not the entrance. The entrance was already behind me, open to the sky. This second door was at the bottom of the steps, solid, inset into the rock. No handle that I could see from above. Just a small iron plate where a lock might be. I stood at the top of the steps with the flashlight in my hand, listening to the wind move through the pines behind me, smelling the cold, dry air coming up out of the earth. There was no second key in the pouch. I checked twice. Whatever was behind that second door, my grandfather hadn't left me the way to open it. Not yet. I lowered the door back into place, slid the hasp shut, snapped the padlock through it, locked. It dropped the key back in the canvas pouch and tied it tight. I pulled the tarp back over and weighted it down with the same stones in the same pattern. I dragged the brush back over the tarp branch by branch until the pile looked exactly like it had when I'd walked up to it. Anybody walking past would see nothing, just a pile of old brush in a forgotten clearing on a worthless ridge. I hiked out. The snow was coming harder now. By the time I made it back to the truck was already filling in. My footprints from that morning were gone. The ridge had erased me. I drove back down to the highway in second gear, the truck's heater fighting the cold air leaking around the door seals. The sleet had stopped, but the sky was the color of dirty wool, and the light was going fast. I was a mile from the farm gate when I saw the second truck. It was parked on the shoulder of County Road, 281, 50 yards short of my driveway. A black Ford, 250 newer model mud-streaked idling. Smoke coming up out of the exhaust. Somebody sitting in the cab. I slowed down as I passed it. The driver was wearing a brown canvas jacket and a feed cap pulled low. I couldn't see his face, but I knew the truck. I'd seen it 100 times. It belonged to Dale Tunstall. I turned in at my gate. I watched him in the rearview mirror. He sat there another 30 seconds. Then he put the truck in gear and drove off slowly west toward town in no particular hurry. I parked by the porch and went inside. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood at the kitchen window in the dark and watched the road. Snow falling slow across the yard. The fence line gone gray-blue in the dusk. Nothing else moved. I went over to the kitchen table. The journal was sitting where I'd left it that morning, open to the entry from September 4th, 1981. Below the line about the pouch in the same careful handwriting, there was another line I hadn't read carefully enough. If you've found the first door, you'll find the second, but not until you understand why I waited. The second key is not on the ridge. It's not in the barn. It's not in the house. The second key is in this valley, in the hand of a man who's been waiting longer than you've been alive. I sat down at the table. I read the line again. Outside, somewhere down the road, I heard the distant sound of a truck engine, idling, then moving, then gone. I didn't know yet what was behind the second door at the bottom of those stone steps. I didn't know who else in Ash Fork, Montana had been waiting 40 years for a Brennan to walk through it. But I was about to find out. And the man with the second key wasn't the only one who'd been watching. Somebody else was watching too, and he'd already started to move. What I found behind those timbers wasn't silver. It was my grandfather's handwriting on a coffee tin and a list of names that changed everything I thought I knew about him. But that came later. First came the waiting. For 3 days after I saw Dale Tunstall's truck on the shoulder, I did nothing. I went to work. I came home. I stoked the fire. I ate canned soup at the kitchen counter. I read the journal at night by the wood stove, and I tried to think the way my grandfather had thought. He'd waited 47 years. He'd done nothing fast. He'd made no move that could be traced. When he'd looked for the second key, wherever it was, in the hand of a man who'd been waiting longer than I'd been alive, he hadn't gone searching for it. He'd let it come to him. So I waited. On the fourth day, a Monday, the bank called. I was at the feed store when my phone rang. Reb Kinsler nodded from the back when he saw me pull it out, which was his way of saying, "Go ahead and take it." The number on the screen was a 406 area code local. I stepped outside into the cold and answered. Hollis Brennan. The voice on the other end was smooth, careful, the kind of voice a man develops when he's spent 30 years convincing other people to sign things they later regret. Speaking. This is Garrett Vollmer at Cascade Mountain Bank. We've got some matters concerning your grandfather's account that I'd like to sit down and discuss with you in person. Today, if possible. I'd been expecting the call for weeks. I hadn't been expecting the in-person. What kind of matters? The kind we don't want to handle over the phone. Could you come by the branch at 3? I told him I'd be there. I went back inside. Reb was rebuilding a hydraulic pump at the workbench in the back. He glanced up but didn't ask. I worked the rest of my shift moving 50-pound sacks of layer feed off a pallet and into a customer's truck bed, and at 2:15 I clocked out and drove into town. Cascade Mountain Bank was on the corner of Main and 2nd. Red brick 2 stories built in 1923. My grandfather had banked there his whole adult life. My grandmother had banked there. My father had banked there. The Brennan family had been customers of that branch for 51 years. I parked across the street, sat in the truck for a minute. Then I went in. Garrett Vollmer's office was on the 2nd floor end of the hall oak door with a brass nameplate, Vice President Commercial and Agricultural Lending. I knocked twice. The door opened. He was 52 years old, 6 feet tall, gray at the temples, expensive haircut. His suit was charcoal. His tie was burgundy. His handshake was dry and firm and lasted exactly 1 second longer than it should have. Hollis, come in, sit down. The office was carpeted in something the color of wet sand. The walls held 2 diplomas, one from the University of Montana, one from a banking institute in Denver. A framed photograph of a fishing boat. No family pictures. No personal touches at all. The office of a man who didn't want people guessing anything about him. He sat across the desk from me. He didn't offer me coffee. He folded his hands on a manila folder and looked at me with a small, practiced smile. I'm going to be direct with you, he said, out of respect for your grandfather, who was a customer here for a long time. I waited. The account is in default. You know that. 4 payments behind going on 5. Under normal circumstances, we'd already have started proceedings. The fact that we haven't is a courtesy, but the courtesy has limits. How long? June 1st, 90 days. If the account isn't brought current by then, the bank will file. You'd have another 90 days after that before sale. 6 months total. That's more time than most people get. I nodded. He opened the folder, took out a single sheet of paper, slid it across the desk. I want to offer you a way out. I looked at the paper. It was a purchase agreement. The bank was offering to buy the farm, the house, the 8 acres, the barn, the equipment, all of it for $95,000, of which $73,000 would go to retire the mortgage. I would walk away with $22,000 and no debt. That's a fair number, Vollmer said. More than fair. The property's been neglected. The roof needs work. The fences are down in places. If you went to market with it after agent fees and repairs and the time it'd take to sell, you'd be lucky to clear 15. I read the paper. I read it twice. I thought about the door at the top of the stone steps, the brass key in the canvas pouch, in the wooden crate in the barn. Why does the bank want this farm? He didn't blink. The smile stayed exactly where it had been. The bank doesn't want it personally. We just want to clear the debt with the least friction for everyone. Then why are you sitting across from me offering to buy it instead of just letting it foreclose? The smile shifted a 1/4 inch. Not enough that you'd see it if you weren't watching for it. Because foreclosure is messy. Because you're young. Because your grandfather was a customer for 50 years, and I'd like this to end clean. I picked up the paper. I folded it once. I slid it back across the desk. I'll bring the account current by June 1st. Hollis, I'll bring it current. He looked at me a long second. Then he sat back. The smile was gone now. His hands were still folded, but the looseness in them had changed. With what exactly? That's my problem, not yours. Hollis, I knew your grandfather. I want to help you here, but I need you to understand what you're walking into. The property's mortgaged for more than it's worth. The market in this valley is soft. There's no path forward that doesn't end with you losing the place. The only question is whether you walk out with 22,000 or with nothing. I stood up. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Vollmer. I walked out. I didn't look back. He didn't follow me into the hall. In the truck, I sat with my hands on the wheel for a minute. Then I started the engine and drove east out of town. I didn't go home. I drove past my own driveway and kept going. 5 miles past the gate, the road climbed up over a saddle and dropped into a long valley where the Tunstall dairy operation spread out across 600 acres of bottom ground. I pulled over at the high point of the saddle and looked down at it through the windshield. 800 head of Holsteins, 3 big metal-roofed barns, a milking parlor that ran twice a day, a bunkhouse for the 4 migrant hands he hired every spring. Dale Tunstall had built it up over 30 years. He'd started with 60 cows on a quarter section. He'd bought everything around him as it came up for sale. He owned every acre that touched mine on 3 sides. The only side he didn't own was the road frontage. And the only piece of land in the valley he hadn't been able to buy was my grandfather's 8 acres. I sat there a long time looking down at it. Then I turned the truck around and drove home. That night, I went back to the barn. I sat at the workbench with the journal open and a yellow legal pad next to it, and I started writing down everything I knew. The Stillwater Ridge parcel. bought by my grandfather in 1971. The Olmsted Mine, the fault line, the first door, the second door I couldn't open. Dale Tunstall, 60 years old, owned the dairy operation, wanted my farm, watched my driveway from the road. Garrett Vollmer, 52, bank vice president, offered to buy me out for $95,000 on a Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock. I underlined that, on a Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock. The deed transfer for Stillwater Ridge had been recorded at the courthouse the previous Tuesday. 6 days ago, the records were public. Anybody who knew to look could have seen that I'd bought 31 acres of useless rock for $47.30. Vollmer had known. That's why he'd called. He wasn't trying to clear a bad mortgage off the bank's books. He was trying to get my whole property, the farm, and the ridge before I figured out why he wanted it. I sat there in the cold barn looking at that yellow pad. Then I went back to the journal and started reading the later entries. The ones from the late 70s and early 80s, the years when whatever had happened to make my grandfather seal the mine behind 2 doors must have happened. I found it in an entry dated October 11th, 1979. Walter came to the house tonight, drunk. Said he knew about the ridge. Said he'd seen me hiking out there last fall with a pick and a sample bag, and he'd been watching me for 2 years. Said if I didn't cut him in on whatever I had up there, he'd file a claim that the vein extended onto state land, and the whole thing would be tied up in court for 20 years. He doesn't know what he's looking at. He thinks it's a regular working claim. He doesn't know about Caldwell's note. He doesn't know about the fault, but he knows enough to do damage. I stared at the name. Walter. I turned the page. October 14th. I went to see Cobb at the county. Quiet conversation off the books. Walter has filed nothing. Yet. But Cobb says he's been asking questions for months. Cobb is an honest man. He says I have time, but not much. October 22nd. Walter came back. Sober this time, sat in my kitchen and laid out terms, 40% to him. He'd handle the legal end. He'd bring in a small crew. He said within 5 years we'd both be set for life. Edith was in the room. She didn't say a word. After he left, she said 2 things. She said I had warned her this was the day she'd been afraid of. And she said, if I took his offer, she would leave me. I told her I would not take his offer. October 30th. Walter has filed a lis pendens against the Stillwater parcel. He's claiming an undeveloped partnership interest based on conversations we supposedly had in 1975. There were no such conversations. He has no proof. But the filing is on the record now. The parcel is encumbered. Nothing can move on it until the matter is settled. I sat back. Walter. The journal entries kept going. Through 1980. Through 1981. A legal fight that dragged on for 19 months. 2 attorneys for my grandfather. 1 in Hamilton, 1 in Missoula. A deposition in February of 1981. A hearing in May. Another in August. The case finally thrown out in September of 1981. For lack of evidence, Walter had been bluffing on the conversations, had no documentation, no witnesses, nothing but his word against my grandfather's. The judge had been a man named Robert Kestrel. He had ruled for my grandfather. He had ordered Walter to pay court costs. Walter had refused. The court had garnished his wages at the lumber mill where he worked for 2 years to recover them. The last name in the entries from that period was on a page dated September 4th, 1981. The same day my grandfather had written the line about the second key being in the hand of a man who'd been waiting longer than I'd been alive. The same day he'd sealed the mine and walked away from it. The name was Walter Vollmer. I read it 3 times before it landed. Vollmer. Walter Vollmer was Garrett Vollmer's father. I sat in that cold barn for a long time. The light from the bare bulb over the workbench was harsh and yellow and made everything look older than it was. Outside, the wind had died. The night had gone completely still. I could hear my own breath. 40 years. The Vollmer family had been waiting 40 years. Walter Vollmer had tried to take the ridge from my grandfather in 1979 and had lost. He died. I didn't know when, but he died at some point in the intervening decades. And his son had grown up, had gone to college, had come back to Bitterroot Valley, had taken a job at the same bank that held the mortgage on the Brennan farm, had climbed the ladder until he was sitting in a vice president's chair with the authority to call me into his office and offer to buy my whole life out from under me for $95,000. He'd been waiting for my grandfather to die. And the day after the deed for Stillwater Ridge had hit the public record at the courthouse, he'd made his move. I closed the journal. I put it in the wooden crate. I put the crate back under the tractor. I covered the tractor with the tarp. I locked the barn door behind me when I went out. I didn't sleep that night either. In the morning, I called Mara Whitlock. Not the older one, the daughter. 20 years old, working in the assessor's office, the building right next door to the records room where I'd seen her mother the week before. We'd gone to high school together. We weren't friends exactly, but we'd been on the volleyball team together for 2 years. And we'd both grown up in this valley, and we both knew what it was to be 20 years old here, with nothing much to do on a Saturday night, except drive around or stay home. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Hollis. Mara, I need your help. I told her what I needed, not why, just what. I needed to know everything she could find in the county records about Walter Vollmer. Property he'd owned, cases he'd been involved in, anything that touched the Brennan name. I needed it fast, and I needed it quiet. She didn't ask. She said okay. She said she'd call me when she had something. She called me back the next afternoon. "There's a lot," she said. "More than I expected. Can you come to the house tonight?" I went to her house at 7. She lived in a converted carriage house behind her parents' place on the south end of town. 1 room with a kitchenette and a bed against the wall. She had a stack of photocopies on the kitchen table when I came in. I had to be careful, she said. I made the copies on my lunch break. I didn't log anything. She poured me a cup of coffee. She sat down across from me. She slid the stack of papers across the table. Walter Vollmer, she said, died in 2003. Lung cancer, same as your grandfather. They worked at the lumber mill together for 15 years. I looked up at her. They what? Your grandfather and Walter Vollmer. Same crew at the St. Regis Mill from 1965 to 1980. They were friends, Hollis. They went hunting together. Walter was at your grandparents' wedding in 1966. There are pictures. She slid a photograph across the table. Black and white faded. A wedding party on the church steps of First Lutheran in Hamilton. My grandfather in a borrowed suit. My grandmother in a simple white dress. And standing 2 people to my grandfather's left. A tall, thin man with dark hair and a thin mustache holding a hat in his hands. That's Walter, she said. I looked at the photograph for a long time. They were friends, I said. Best friends until 1979. She pulled out the next document. It was a court filing from October of 1979. The lease pendants my grandfather had written about. I scanned through it. Then the next document and the next. The transcript of the May 1981 hearing. The judge's ruling from September. A garnishment order against Walter Vollmer's wages at the mill dated October 1981. Then she pulled out something else. A property record. Look at this. It was a foreclosure notice, dated April of 1982. Cascade Mountain Bank versus Walter and Helene Vollmer. A small place on the north end of town. 2 acres, a house, a detached garage. He lost the house, she said, 6 months after he lost the lawsuit. The garnishment took more than he could afford. He defaulted on the mortgage. The bank took it. I stared at the foreclosure notice. Who held the note? Cascade Mountain Bank. Same bank his son works at now. I sat back. There's more, she said. She pulled out a single page, a copy of a newspaper article from the Raleigh Republic, dated November of 1982. The headline read, "Local man found dead in apparent suicide." She nodded. His uncle, who killed himself after the family lost everything. And Garrett's father, Edmund, was the one who died, not Walter. So Garrett grew up watching his father pull the trigger because of what happened with my grandfather and the ridge. That's how he'd see it. I put my hands flat on the table. What happened to Walter? He lived another 20 years, worked odd jobs, drank, died of lung cancer in 2003 in a single-wide trailer outside of Stevensville. He's buried in the same cemetery as your grandfather Hollis. They're 2 rows apart. I sat there a long minute. Then I asked her what I most needed to ask. Did my grandfather know about Edmund, about Garrett? I don't know. But your grandfather started writing checks to a woman named Helene Vollmer in November of 1982 and didn't stop until she died in 1991. $300 a month for 9 years. I found it in the old bank ledgers. Cashier's checks, no signature on the memo line, but the same handwriting every time. His handwriting. I closed my eyes. He'd known. He'd known what his old friend's family was going through. He'd known about the boy. And he'd quietly, without telling anyone, taken on a piece of the responsibility for keeping that family afloat through the worst of it. Because that's who he was. And the boy, Garrett, had grown up never knowing where those checks came from. Had grown up believing the Brennan family had destroyed his. Mara was watching my face. Hollis, what is going on? I told her some of it. Not the mine, not the silver. Just that Garrett Vollmer had called me into the bank 2 days ago and offered to buy my whole property for less than it was worth, and I was now reasonably sure he wasn't doing it because the bank wanted the property. I told her I thought he wanted it personally, and he wanted it now, and I didn't yet understand why he was in such a hurry. She thought about it. He's been at the bank for 9 years, she said. He could have moved on you any time after your grandfather got sick. He didn't. He waited until your grandfather was dead. Then he waited another 3 months. Then you bought the ridge, and the next business day he called you in. So something about the ridge changed his timeline. Or something about you owning it. I drove home that night through a hard, cold wind off the mountains. The sky was clear and full of stars, and the kind of black you only see this far from cities. I pulled into the gate at the farm and stopped to lock it behind me, which I'd never bothered to do before, and which I'd be doing every night from now on. For the next 2 weeks, I worked. I went to the feed store 5 days a week. I came home and ate dinner and waited until full dark, and then I went out into the yard with a flashlight and a shovel and my grandfather's journal. He'd left me a second map. The one inside the mine I couldn't enter, but also a third map hidden in the back of the journal that I almost missed. A folded piece of graph paper, browned and brittle, that I found tucked into the inside back cover when I went looking through the book a 4th time. The map showed the 8 acres around the house, the barn, the chicken coop, the smokehouse, the old well, the split rail fence that ran along the east property line, and on the map, in 9 specific spots, my grandfather had drawn small X's. 9 X's, 9 caches, right here on the home place. The first one was under the front porch step. He'd written first in tiny letters beside it. Inside were 42 Morgan silver dollars, heavy in my hand. The dates ran from 1878 to 1904. I picked one up and held it to the porch light, uncirculated. The eagle on the back was sharp as the day it had been struck. I closed the tin. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table for an hour and didn't move. The second cache was in the smokehouse under a flagstone at the back left corner. A mason jar sealed with wax full of rolled bills. 20s and 50s. I counted them out on the kitchen table at midnight. $840 in cash, all of it, from the 1960s. The bills crisp, the way bills are, when they've been sealed away from air for 50 years. The third was buried under the rose bush my grandmother had planted in 1968 by the kitchen door. A coffee can. Inside the can, wrapped in oilcloth, were 23 American gold eagles, 1-ounce coins, dates ranging from 1986 to 2009. At Spot Market that night, looking it up on my phone in the kitchen, they were worth around $46,000. $46,000 under a rose bush. I sat with the coins spread out on the kitchen table, and I tried to do the math on what it must have taken him. A factory worker at a lumber mill, a small-scale farmer, a man who never went out to dinner, never took a vacation, never spent $1 on himself. Year after year, decade after decade, putting away what little he could spare and turning it into something hard, something portable, something that would still be worth what it was worth, no matter what happened to the dollar or the bank or the country. For me, I put the coins back in the can. I sealed it back up. I buried it again exactly where it had been, under the rose bush, with the same dirt patted down the same way. I told no one, but somebody knew. The fourth night, I went looking a Tuesday in late March. I came back from the barn at midnight and walked out to the spot in the journal marked East Fence, 5th Post, from corner. I crossed the pasture in the dark, and I came up to the fence line, and I stopped. The 5th post from the corner had been pulled up. Somebody had dug a hole next to it, not deep, maybe 2 feet. The dirt was piled to one side. The post had been laid down in the grass. They hadn't found anything. The cache was 3 feet down, not 2. Whoever it was had given up too soon or been interrupted or hadn't been sure of the exact spot. But they'd known where to look. I stood there in the dark with my flashlight off, and I listened. The night was still. The cattle were quiet in Dale Tunstall's pasture on the other side of the fence. No traffic on the road. No engines anywhere. But somebody had been in my pasture in the last 12 hours. I walked the rest of the fence line that night, slowly, carefully. I found 2 more places where someone had been digging. Not at the cache spots, but near them. Close enough that the digger had been working from some kind of information, but not close enough that they had a map. They were searching by guesswork, within 10 or 15 feet of where they needed to be, but not on top of it. I went back to the house and I sat at the kitchen window in the dark with my grandfather's old rifle across my lap, and I watched the road and the gate until the sun came up. Nothing moved. In the morning, I went to see Sheriff Castellano. The sheriff's office was in the Ravalli County Justice Center in Hamilton, the same building as the courthouse. Boyd Castellano was 62 years old, broad in the shoulders, gray in the beard, 3rd generation Bitterroot Valley. His grandfather had immigrated from northern Italy and started a vineyard outside Corvallis that hadn't survived the Depression. His father had been a logger. He'd been sheriff for 16 years. He took me back to his office. He closed the door. He pointed me at the chair across the desk. "Talk to me, Hollis." I talked. I told him most of what I knew. I told him about the digging on my property. I told him I had reason to believe somebody was looking for something on my land. I told him about Garrett Vollmer's offer at the bank. I didn't tell him about the mine. I didn't tell him about the journal. I just told him I had reason to think somebody was watching the place. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't take notes. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair, and he looked at me a long time before he spoke. Hollis, I knew your grandfather. I know. He and I went elk hunting in the Pintlers in 1994. He'd known my father, long ways back. Yes, sir. He thought about it. You know the history between your family and the Vollmers. I know some of it. How much? I told him what Mara had given me. The lawsuit, the foreclosure, Edmund Vollmer's suicide, the money my grandfather had sent to the widow for 9 years without ever telling anyone. He nodded slowly. I knew about the money, he said. Your grandfather told my father about it once, asked him to keep it quiet. My father did. I've kept it quiet too, until right now. Why are you telling me? Because Garrett Vollmer is in trouble at the bank. I waited. I'm not going to tell you what I know, Castellano said. It's an active matter federal level and it's not mine. But I've been talking with people in Helena and people in Denver for about 18 months. I'm going to tell you this much, Hollis. If Garrett Vollmer has offered to buy your property at any price, you should be very careful about why he wants it. The bank may not be involved in his offer at all. He may be acting on his own, and he may need that property to do something he can't do without it. Like what? Like make a problem of his go away. I sat there a long minute. Sheriff, is somebody trespassing on my property at night? Probably. What do I do? You don't catch them in the act. You don't confront anybody. You call me. You lock your gate. You don't go out at night alone. And you understand that whatever you've got out there, that somebody else wants the fastest way for you to lose it, is for you to be hurt, or for the law to get involved in a way that puts the property in dispute. You understand what I'm telling you? Yes, sir. Good. He sat forward. He folded his hands on the desk. There's one more thing, Hollis. Your grandfather came to see me about 6 months before he died. He told me he wanted me to know something. He wouldn't tell me what. He said if anything ever happened on the Brennan place after he was gone, any trouble, any inquiries, anything strange, I should make sure to be patient before I acted. He said you'd figure it out. He said you were smarter than he was at your age. He said when you knew what you needed, you'd come find me. He said that. He said that. I looked down at my hands. He was right about you, Castellano said. You're sitting in front of me. You came when you knew what to ask. Sheriff, who is the man with the second key? He looked at me. Then he smiled just a little the way a man smiles when he hears the right question at the right time. I don't know about a key, he said. But I know who your grandfather trusted. And I know there's an old man in this valley who's been sitting in a hardware store on the corner of 3rd and Pine for 46 years, waiting for a Brennan to walk through the front door and ask the right question. You might try him. I drove out of the parking lot of the Justice Center, and I drove straight to the corner of 3rd and Pine. The sign over the door read, Coin and Sons Hardware. The paint was old. The window in the door had been replaced once, maybe twice. The store had been there since 1948. I parked across the street. I sat in the truck for a long time. Then I got out and I walked across the street and I pushed open the door, and the bell over the door rang the way it had been ringing since 1948. And the old man behind the counter looked up at me, and he set down the catalog he'd been reading. He looked at me for a long second. He took in my face. He took in my coat. He took in the deed for Stillwater Ridge that I didn't know was showing a corner above my coat pocket. His eyes went wet. Lord have mercy, he said quietly. You look just like him. His name was Earl Coyne. He was 68 years old. He had been waiting for me since the autumn of 1981, and he had something in a small brass box under the till that he had been holding for 37 years. They took the smallest box because they didn't know any better. My grandfather had counted on that. He'd counted on me knowing the difference. But before I get to what was in that brass box under Earl Coyne's, till I have to tell you about the morning I found the cellar door pried open. It was the last day of March, a Sunday. I had come back from town the night before, back from a long supper at Mara Whitlock's place, where she'd cooked me eggs and bacon at 9 o'clock at night. The way young people do when they don't know yet that the rest of life will not always let them eat what they want when they want. And I had locked the gate behind me, and I had gone to bed with my grandfather's old rifle leaned against the wall beside the bedroom door. I slept hard. I hadn't been sleeping hard. When I woke up, the sun was already over the sapphire ridgeline. The bedroom was bright. I sat up and I looked at the clock, and it was 8:20 in the morning, the latest I'd slept since November. I went downstairs in my socks. I started the coffee. I went to the back porch to bring in firewood, and as I bent to lift the first split of larch, I saw through the gap in the porch boards a footprint in the snow at the foot of the back steps. The footprint was not mine. It was a man's boot. Pacific tread, the cleated kind a lineman wears, or a logger. Bigger than my foot by 2 sizes. The print pointed away from the house toward the barn. I went back inside. I got my coat. I got the rifle. I walked out to the barn. The chain on the barn door had been cut. Bolt cutters, clean job, the broken link still hanging from the loop where the padlock had been. The lock itself was lying in the snow 6 feet from the door. I pushed the door open with the barrel of the rifle. I went inside. The barn looked the same. The workbench was where I had left it. The tools hung on the pegboard the way my grandfather had hung them in 1964. The tarp was still draped over the 1953 Alice Chalmers in the corner. Nothing was disturbed, except for one thing. Behind the workbench in the corner farthest from the door, there was a hatch in the floor I had never paid much attention to. A cellar door 2 planks wide, set flush into the barn floor. My grandfather had used the space underneath it for storing potatoes in burlap sacks when I was a kid. I had not opened it once since the funeral. It was open now. The padlock was on the floor beside it, not cut, picked. The shackle was unmarked. I knelt down. I looked into the hole. The cellar was small, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, with a dirt floor and rough plank walls. A short wooden ladder led down. There was nothing in the cellar. That wasn't right. There should have been 4 burlap sacks of seed potatoes from last fall, and a wooden crate I had pushed down there in November when I was clearing the porch of my grandfather's old planting jars. There should have been a small wooden box, no bigger than a cigar box, that I had set on top of the crate the same day. The box was the only thing missing. I had not put anything of value in that box. I had put my grandfather's reading glasses and the tobacco pipe he'd smoked once a year on Christmas, and a few buttons cut off of his old wool shirts before I'd given the shirts to Goodwill. Sentimental things. Things only I would have known were there. Whoever had come into my barn in the night had gone straight to that hatch, had picked the lock, had taken the smallest thing in the cellar, and had left the burlap sacks of potatoes and the wooden crate full of jars sitting right there in the dirt. They had been told what to look for. They had been told it was small. They had been told it was hidden. They had not been told what it looked like. They had taken the wrong box. I climbed out of the cellar. I stood in the barn with the rifle across my forearm, and I looked at the workbench. I looked at the tarp. I looked at the wooden crate underneath the tarp, with the journal inside it, and the brass surveyor's compass, and the canvas pouch with the key to the first door on Stillwater Ridge. They had not touched the crate. They had been looking, but they had been looking for the wrong thing in the wrong place. They had been told that something small and valuable was hidden in the Brennan barn. They had come in. They had searched the most obvious hiding spot. They had taken what they found. They were not coming back today. They thought they had it. I went into the house. I picked up the phone. I called Sheriff Castellano at his home number, which he had written on the back of his business card before I left his office on Wednesday. He came out himself. No deputy. Just him in his personal truck, a brown Chevy, no markings. He looked at the cut chain. He looked at the picked lock. He looked into the empty cellar. He didn't say much. When we were standing together in the barn alone, he turned to me and he said, "Did they get anything you can't replace?" "No, sir." "Did they get anything they'll be able to identify as belonging to you?" "No." "Good. Then you and I are going to take a walk." We walked the property line that morning. Sheriff Castellano and I in the cold with our boots crunching the crust of the late March snow. He showed me where the boot prints came in. They came in from the road, not from the Tunstall side. They came in over the cattle gate by the cedar gate I'd hung the night before. The intruder had climbed over the gate, walked along the inside of the fence line for 200 yards to avoid being seen from the house, and then cut across the pasture to the barn. It was one man, working alone. He had not been in a hurry. "You know who this is?" I asked. "I have an idea. I'm not going to share it with you. Not yet." "Why not?" "Because if you knew, you'd do something stupid. And right now, the best thing you can do is nothing. Let him think he got what he came for. Let him take what's in that box back to whoever sent him. Let them open it and see your grandfather's pipe and his reading glasses. Let them feel like fools. And then they'll come back, and next time I'll be ready." He went home that afternoon. He told me to call him if I saw anything, to keep the gate locked, to keep the rifle loaded, but to keep it in the house and not on me. He told me to go to work the next day and act like nothing had happened. I did all of that. The next afternoon, Monday, the first day of April, I drove into town and I parked across the street from Coyne and Sons Hardware, and I went in. The bell rang. Earl Coyne looked up from his catalog. He set it down. He stood up. He was 68 years old. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall. He wore a gray flannel shirt and brown wool trousers and reading glasses pushed up into his thinning white hair. His hands were knotted with arthritis. His eyes were the color of weathered cedar. He had owned the hardware store since 1973, when he had bought it from his father, who had opened it in 1948. "Hollis," he said, "I was hoping you'd come back." I had come in once before the previous Friday afternoon, the day I had walked across the street from the courthouse. I had stood in his store, and he had looked at me, and he had cried a little quietly in front of his cash register, and then he had collected himself and told me that he had something to give me, but that he wanted me to come back when I had time to sit and listen, because what he had to give me came with a story. I had told him I would come back when I could. I had needed 2 days to do what I had needed to do. The cellar, the sheriff, the slow recalibration of my understanding of what was happening around me. I was back now. Earl Coyne flipped the sign on his door from open to back in 1 hour. He locked the front door. He walked me to the back of the store, past the bins of nails and the aisle of plumbing fittings and the rack of work boots, into a small office behind the storeroom. The office had 2 chairs and a desk and a coffee pot. The walls were covered with old photographs. He poured me a cup of coffee. He poured one for himself. He sat down across the desk from me. For a long minute, he didn't speak. He just looked at me. Then he said, "Your grandfather walked into this store on a Saturday morning in October of 1981. He had a small brass box under his arm. He set it on the counter. He said he needed me to hold something for him. He said it might be a year. It might be 10 years. It might be longer. He said, when the right person came in to ask for it, I would know. And he said if I died before that person came, I was to leave instructions for my son to keep holding it. and my son was to leave instructions for his son. Earl Coin reached under the desk. He pulled out a small brass box, the kind a jeweler would have used in the 19th century to hold loose stones. It was 4 inches by 6 inches by 2 inches deep. It had a small hasp on the front. It was unlocked. He slid it across the desk to me. "I never opened it," he said. "Not once, in 37 years. He asked me not to. I didn't." I looked at the box. "He said one more thing," Earl said. "He said if a man named Vollmer ever came into my store and asked about it, I was to tell him I had no such box, and I had never heard of one. He said if anyone else from the Vollmer family asked, the answer was the same. He said I should expect them to ask within a year. He was wrong about that. They didn't ask for 37 years. They asked recently." "Garrett Vollmer came in here 3 weeks ago. Said he was looking for some property that might have belonged to his Uncle Edmund. Said he understood I'd been a friend of Edmund's. I told him I'd never been a friend of Edmund's, and I didn't know what he was talking about. He left. He hasn't been back." I picked up the box. It was heavier than I expected. Inside, something shifted slightly as I lifted it. I opened it. Inside the box were 3 things. The first was a small brass key, smaller than the one I had used on the first door at the top of Stillwater Ridge. The shaft was thinner. The head was different. It was the key to a different lock. The second was a folded piece of paper, white brittle at the edges, the creases dark with age. The third was a thick envelope sealed with red wax. I unfolded the paper first. It was a deed, filed and notarized, dated September 18th, 1971, 6 months after my grandfather had paid the back taxes on the Stillwater Ridge parcel. It was the original deed of a mineral claim registered with the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. The claim was for all subsurface mineral rights to the Stillwater Ridge parcel in perpetuity, granted to Silas Reese Brennan and his heirs. He had bought the surface rights for $43 in March of 1971. He had bought the mineral rights separately and quietly 6 months later for $200 from the state of Montana. He had owned everything. The dirt, the rock, the silver in the rock, the air above the dirt, the water below the rock. Everything that was on or under those 31 acres had been his legally completely since 1971. No one could file a competing claim. No one could argue that he had been mining without permission. Walter Vollmer's lawsuit in 1979 had failed, in part because Walter had not known what my grandfather had quietly done in the autumn of 1971 on a Tuesday afternoon while no one was watching. The deed was now mine. I set it down. I looked at the envelope sealed with red wax. Earl Coin was watching me. "I think that's for you to read alone," he said. "Not in front of me. Take it home." "What is it?" "I don't know. He didn't tell me. I just know it's for you." I put the envelope back in the box. I put the deed back in the box. I picked up the small brass key and I closed my hand around it. Earl, the key. I don't know what it opens. He never told me. He never told you anything. He told me one thing, Hollis. When he handed me this box in 1981, he sat where you're sitting now and he drank a cup of coffee. And before he left, he said, Earl, if I do this right, my granddaughter will walk in here in 40 years and she'll need this box. If I do it wrong, my granddaughter will never know I existed. And he stood up and he shook my hand and he walked out. Earl took off his glasses. He wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist. He did it right, Hollis. I drove home with the brass box on the passenger seat. I locked the gate behind me. I went into the kitchen. I built up the fire in the wood stove. I sat at the kitchen table and I opened the envelope sealed with red wax. Inside were 6 pages folded together. My grandfather's handwriting. The first page was dated August 27th, 1981. The last page was dated the same day. He had written it all in one sitting. 7 days before he sealed the second door. 7 days before he wrote the final entry in the journal I had been reading for 2 months. He had known by then that he was finishing something. He had known what he was leaving behind. He had taken the time to explain. I read it slowly, once, then twice. Then I sat in the kitchen for an hour with the pages spread out in front of me, and I cried for the first time since the funeral. This is what he wrote. He told me about Tomas Krebs, his friend in the Anaconda copper mines, the man who had been killed in the roof collapse in 1962. He told me that after Tomas died, he had taken it on himself to send money to Tomas's widow every month for 2 years until she remarried. He had never told anyone. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, and because there had been no one else to do it, and because Tomas would have done it for him. Walter had lost in court because he had no case. None of that had been my grandfather's fault. My grandfather had started sending money to Edmund's widow, Helene, in the same week as the funeral. $300 a month in cashier's checks, no return address. He had done it for 9 years until Helene Vollmer had died of breast cancer in 1991, and the boy Garrett, by then 23 years old, and finishing his last semester at the University of Montana, had received a final lump sum from an anonymous source that had paid off the last of his student loans. My grandfather had never told Helene where the money came from. He had never told Garrett. He had never told his own wife. He had told no one until he sat down at this kitchen table on a Thursday morning in August of 1981 and wrote it all down for a granddaughter who hadn't yet been born. He had done this. He wrote not because he had to. He had done it because if a man takes something from the world that the world doesn't know he took, he owes the world something back. He had not taken silver out of Stillwater Ridge, but he had owned it. He had had it in his power to take it to live richer than any of his neighbors, to leave his family wealthy. He had chosen not to. He had chosen to leave it in the ground. But the choice to leave it in the ground had not been free. The lawsuit had cost him money. The lawyers had cost him money. The fear and the silence and the loss of his oldest friendship had cost him things money could not measure. And in the end, the choice he had made to leave the silver where it was to keep his marriage to my grandmother, to keep his promise to her, had cost another man his life. Because Walter Vollmer had been the kind of man who could not take losing. My grandfather had not pulled the trigger. He had not pushed Walter to do what Walter did. But he had been a piece of a chain that ended with a fatherless boy. And he had spent the rest of his life trying to pay that boy back without ever letting the boy know. He wrote on the 3rd page, "I am going to seal the mine next week. I have a key for the first door, and I have a key for the second door. I am leaving one key here in this box with Earl Coyne, who is the only man in this valley I trust completely. The other key I will leave somewhere on the home place where you will find it when you are ready. If you are reading this, you have already found one. By the time you find the other, you will understand why I left them in 2 places. I am leaving you the mine. I am leaving you the silver. I am leaving you the deed to both the surface and the rights below. They are legally and completely yours. No one can take them. But Hollis, I am also leaving you something else. There are 7 families in this valley I have helped quietly over the years. Some of them know. Most of them do not. The Krebs family in Butte. The Vollmer widow and the boy. A family named Halloran in Corvallis, whose father lost his hands in the mill in 1972. A family named Osland, whose mother had her cancer come back in 1986. The Pike family, Harlan, who works at the recorder's office. His father lost his farm to the same bank that holds our mortgage now, and I bought it back for him in 1984 and signed it over for $1. The Whitlock family, whose son drowned in the Bitterroot in 1989 and who I paid the funeral costs for. The Coyne family, Earl's sister Della, who needed a kidney in 1996 and had no insurance, and the money came from an anonymous donor. That was me. 7 families. 3 of them the help is finished. The Krebses, the Hallorans, the Pikes, they are on their own feet now, and they have been for a long time. They don't need anything from anyone. The other 4, the Vollmers, the Ostlands, the Whitlocks, the Coynes, there are still parts of those debts I did not finish paying. There are children of those families who are alive now who don't yet know they will need help. There are grandchildren coming who will. The list is in the back of the journal. The amounts I had set aside for them are with the silver in the 2nd chamber behind the 2nd door. The key in this box opens that door. Hollis, I did not leave you a fortune so you could be rich. I left you a fortune so you could finish what I started. If you take the silver and you sell it and you buy yourself a new truck, and you move to Bozeman, I will not haunt you. You are 20 years old, and you are alone in the world, and you have every right to take what is yours and use it for yourself. But if you do that, no one will help the Osland boy when his father gets sick in 5 years. No one will help the Whitlock grandchild with the medical bills that are coming. No one will help Earl Coyne's nephew get through the trade school he wants to attend in 2024, but cannot afford. No one will keep this valley standing. And no one will help the Vollmer boy. He is angry, Hollis. He has been angry his whole life, and he has been angry at the wrong people, for the wrong reasons. If you are reading this, he is somewhere in your story by now, and he is making it hard on you. I am sorry for that. He learned the wrong lesson from what happened to his father, and there was no way for me to teach him the right one without exposing 9 years of cashier's checks and breaking my own promise to his mother. If you can, Hollis, when this is all done, find a way to tell him. Not the part about the silver, just the part about the money. He deserves to know that someone was watching out for him when he was a boy. He deserves to know his father was not entirely abandoned. He deserves to know it before he becomes a man like his Uncle Walter, because he is closer to that than he knows. The list is in the back of the journal. The names of the 4 families and the amounts, the instructions, the accounts I have set up for them, which you will find when you open the second door. I trust you, Hollis. I have always trusted you. From the day you came to live with me when you were 6 years old, and you sat at this same kitchen table, eating a peanut butter sandwich, and told me you were going to be a veterinarian, I have trusted that you would grow up to be the kind of person who finishes what other people start. Be careful. Be patient. Don't be fast. And remember that the man who finds out you have what he has been looking for is the man who will hurt you for it. Don't let him find out. Use the sheriff. He is a good man. He was a friend of mine for 40 years. I love you, Hollis. I am sorry I did not live long enough to tell you this in person. But I left you what I could. Your grandfather, Silas Reese Brennan. I folded the pages back together. I put them on the kitchen table next to the brass box. I sat for a long time looking at the wood stove. Then I got up and I went out to the barn and I got the journal out of the wooden crate under the tractor. I brought it back to the kitchen. I turned to the very back past the last dated entry to a page I had read before and had not understood. The page held a list of 4 families, 4 sets of names, 4 sets of numbers, 4 sets of bank account numbers at a credit union in Missoula with my name listed as a cosigner on each. I went up the ridge the next morning. The snow was melting in patches now. The air smelled like wet ground for the first time since November. I cleared the brush off the first door. I unlocked it with the larger brass key. I went down the 23 stone steps. I came to the second door, the one inset into the rock. I used the smaller key. It turned. The second door opened into a room, maybe 15 feet by 20 feet. The walls were limestone. The floor was packed earth. The ceiling was timbered with old oak beams my grandfather had cut and milled himself. The room was dry. The room was clean. The room had been kept. Along the back wall, on wooden shelves, stood 21 canvas bags, each one tied at the neck with waxed twine, each one labeled in my grandfather's hand. I lifted one. It weighed maybe 15 pounds. I loosened the twine. I looked inside. Silver. Native silver ore grade smelted into rough ingots. 21 bags. Each one labeled with a year. 1973 through 1993. 21 years of small, careful work done in secret weekends and evenings, the work of a man who had said he would not mine the ridge while his wife was alive and had kept his word on the visible surface, but had quietly proven himself wrong, underneath just enough to set aside what his family would need. On the right-hand wall, on a different set of shelves, were the things in jars. Mason jars, 24 of them. Some held silver dollars. Some held gold coins. Some held rolled bills. Some held single thick gold ingots, 1 ounce the weight of a heavy stone in the palm of a hand. On the left-hand wall was a small writing desk. On the desk was a leather-bound ledger. Inside the ledger was every transaction my grandfather had ever made on behalf of 7 families over 4 decades. Dates, amounts, recipients, notes, all of it accounted for, all of it documented. Nothing he had done in the dark had been hidden from himself. At the back of the ledger were the 4 families he had not finished helping. The Ostlunds, the Whitlocks, the Coins, the Vollmers. Beside each name was a number. The numbers totaled $386,000. I sat down at the desk. I read the ledger from beginning to end. It took me 4 hours. When I came up out of the mine, the sun was low over the sapphires. I locked both doors behind me. I covered the first door with brush. I hiked back to the truck. I drove home. That night, I called Sheriff Castellano. I told him I had found what I had been looking for. I told him I needed his help to do 4 things over the next year, slowly, quietly, without telling anyone, and I needed him to know about them in case anything happened to me. I told him I would be paying off the Brennan Farm mortgage in cash within 30 days. I told him I would also be paying off 3 other mortgages in this valley within 90 days at 3 different banks on 3 different families' homes, and that none of those families could ever know it had been me. He listened. He did not ask why. When I was done, he said, "Hollis, did your grandfather leave you a list?" "Yes, sir." "How many names?" 4. He told me once there'd be 4 left when he was gone. He said he hoped his granddaughter would finish them. I told him I'd help her if she ever asked. "I'm asking Sheriff." "Then we'll start tomorrow." We started the next morning. It took 11 months. By the end of February 2023, of the 4 families were taken care of. The Brennan farm was free and clear. 8 Hereford heifers were grazing in the back pasture, and one of them was named Edith after my grandmother. The barn had a new roof. The fence line was rebuilt. The cedar gate still swung clean on the hinges my grandfather had set in concrete in 1981. Garrett Vollmer never came to my door again. In April of 2019, 2 weeks after the night, somebody broke into my barn and took the wrong box. The FBI opened an investigation into Cascade Mountain Bank with the cooperation of Sheriff Boyd Castellano. The investigation took 14 months. Garrett Vollmer was indicted in June of 2020 on 7 counts of mortgage fraud and 1 count of wire fraud for a long-running scheme that had nothing to do with my grandfather and everything to do with his own decision made in his early 40s to be a different kind of man than the men who had raised him. He pled guilty. He served 31 months in federal custody. He paid restitution. He never knew as he went into prison that an anonymous account was paying the property taxes on his Uncle Edmund's small grave in the cemetery on the hill in Stevensville. He never knew when he came out of prison that another anonymous account had quietly settled the small medical debt his elderly mother had been struggling with for 3 years. He never knew it was me. He may never know. Dale Tunstall sold his dairy operation in the autumn of 2019 to a corporate buyer out of Idaho. He moved to Arizona. I have not seen him since. Earl Coyne is 75 years old now. He still runs the hardware store on the corner of 3rd and Pine. His nephew is in his 2nd year at the trade school in Helena. Earl pays for everything. As far as the nephew knows, the money comes from a small inheritance Earl received from a great-aunt in Spokane. There was no great-aunt in Spokane. There was a granddaughter in Bitterroot Valley who had promised an old man in a small brass box in a back office that some debts get paid forward. The Whitlock family lost their oldest daughter to a drunk driver in November of 2021. The funeral was paid for. The mortgage was paid off 6 months later. They believe it was a life insurance policy they did not know they had. The Osland boy is 14 years old. His father is healthy. The trust fund will be there when the cancer comes back, as the doctors have said it likely will. The 4th name on the list is still uncrossed. It is the hardest one. It is the one my grandfather asked me to do in the letter sealed with red wax that I have not yet found a way to do without breaking what he asked me to keep whole. The boy is 53 years old now. He is in federal prison in Sheridan, Oregon. He has 14 months left on his sentence. When he comes out, his mother will be 82. His house will be paid for. His mother's medical bills will be cleared. There will be a job waiting for him at a small fencing company outside of Hamilton, run by a man named Reb Kinsler, who will not know why he has been asked to hire a man with a federal felony on his record. But who will do it because Sheriff Boyd Castellano asked him to as a personal favor. And on the day Garrett Vollmer comes out of prison, there will be a letter waiting for him at the halfway house in Missoula. It will not be signed. It will tell him that for 9 years of his boyhood, a man he never met sent his mother $300 a month in cashier's checks. It will tell him that his father was not forgotten. It will tell him that what was taken from him was not taken by the Brennans, and that the Brennans were not the enemy of his family. It will tell him this in the same handwriting his Uncle Walter would have recognized, copied with care from a notebook bound in cracked leather and ink the color of old water. It will be the last entry I make in my grandfather's journal. And after that, the list will be done, and I will close the book, and I will set it back in the wooden crate underneath the 1953 Alice Chalmers in the back of the barn, where it will wait for the next person in this family who needs to find it. I am 23 years old now. I run 8 Herefords on the back pasture, and I keep a small flock of laying hens by the kitchen door, and I work 3 days a week at the feed store, and the rest of the time on this land. I am not rich. The silver in the mine is still in the mine, untouched, exactly as my grandfather left it. Most of what he left in the second chamber is gone, now paid out to 4 families across this valley over 4 years. What remains will pay for my own life modestly. For as long as I am careful, I still go up to Stillwater Ridge sometimes. I walk past the cairns. I sit on the high point of the ridge where the wind comes down off the sapphires, and I watch the valley below the small grid of fields, the line of cottonwoods along the river, the smoke from chimneys in Ashfork 20 miles away. My grandfather was a quiet man. He worked underground for 12 years and above ground for 50 more, and in all that time, he never told anyone what he had done or why, and he never asked anyone to thank him for it. He did not leave me silver. He left me a list. He left me a way to be useful. He left me the knowledge that a person's life is measured not by what they take out of the world, but by what they put back into it when no one is looking. I'm not done yet. There are still names being written in valleys like this one all across this country by old men in flannel shirts who don't talk about what they do. There are still grandchildren they're waiting for. There are still keys in brass boxes under the tills of small hardware stores in small towns waiting for the right person to walk through the door and ask the right question. If you're one of those grandchildren and you don't yet know what you've been left, I'll tell you what I wish someone had told me sooner. Look in the barn. Look under the tractor. Read the journal. And then go finish what he started.